What we're about to talk about is the most powerful and taboo use of Nen in all of Hunter x Hunter, because Nen is an art form where you can only produce what you're willing to give. And if you're willing to give your life, then as it turns out, you can produce something truly horrifying and lingering abilities that very few living Nen users could ever hope to match up to. This is the morbidly fascinating world of post-mortem Nen. I think that we should get straight into it with an introductory example. Royal Guard Neferpito had a curious Hatsu called Puppet Master Serenity Terpsichora. Most of Pito's abilities are puppet related, and usually they have to do with Pito controlling others. However, Pito also came up with a combat oriented use as well, which was to create not a puppet but a puppeteer in order to control Pito themselves in combat. The principle behind it is very similar to Shinnok's autopilot and Killua's whirlwind. The idea of all three of these abilities is to increase combat potency by bypassing the nervous system. Instead of a stimuli sending a message to the brain and then the brain sending a message back to the muscles, Pito, Shinnok, and Killua all have immediate muscle responses, and in Pito's case, that's due to the puppeteer's control. It takes Pito less than 0.1 of a second to activate and launch an attack with Terpsichora, and it is undoubtedly Neferpito's most powerful form, and thus why Pito chose to use it against Gon when he transformed into a big boy. And not only that, but Pito, whether intentional or not, made a Nen vow to, quote, dance beyond my limit, which was in response to sensing that Gon may have been powerful enough to seriously threaten the Ant King. And this devotion to Pito's king, to Meruem, exceeded Pito's concern for individual life by an order of magnitude. And so once Pito was killed by Gon, Terpsichora remained in this world to carry out Pito's command of, quote, dance beyond my limit, and puppeteered Pito's corpse to continue to attack Gon until the rest of the corpse was brutally dismantled. So this right here is a perfect, simple example of post-mortem Nen. To boil it down, it's when a personal emotion transcends life, because Nen, or more accurately, Aura, is life force, and if you have a concern that trumps your own life, then you are subconsciously applying Aura for that purpose instead of the purpose of your life, and thus it lingers on to fulfill that desire. Another textbook example of this is the Sun and Moon paired destruction, an ability literally found in a book, Crollo's book. However, it should not be there, as it originally belonged to an entity known only as the Meteor City Elder, and the ability functions by giving someone the power to mark objects with either a sun or a moon, and if a sun mark comes into contact with a moon mark, then it creates a big ol' explosion. The idea behind this Hatsu was a defense mechanism to protect Meteor City, because the only thing that Meteor City has in large quantities is people. So the Meteor City Elder would mark defensive agents with both a sun and a moon, creating an army of self-detonating individuals to defend the city. There's a more accurate word for that I can't use on YouTube, but you get the idea. However, after the Meteor City Elder passed away, his ability remained in Crollo's book, which again, it shouldn't. Usually when an ability owner dies, the Hatsu vanishes from Skill Hunter. That is one of Crollo's conditions. However, the Elder's desire to protect Meteor City was much greater than the concern for his own life, and so the ability remained in the mortal world to continue to serve its intended purpose. Although this does bring up the fact that abilities that linger are not locked into serving their original purpose. As demonstrated by Crollo, even someone's post-mortem will can be manipulated and applied in other ways. In fact, most famously, the Sun and the Moon was part of a 6-step plan to kill Hisoka in Heaven's Arena, which you can maybe argue was still in spirit of the original idea, because Hisoka was trying to kill Crollo, a resident of Meteor City, but it's also unknown what would happen to this ability if and probably when Crollo dies. Theoretically, Skill Hunter would then disappear from this world, and in it, the Sun and the Moon also. But one of the most recent and kind of creepy post-mortem abilities we've encountered in Hunter x Hunter is Zombie Girl, La Vie en Rose, which is a reference to an Edith Piaf song. Literally means life in pink, and in English it's the equivalent of seeing things through rose-colored glasses, which is how the original user of this ability saw life. Her name was Misha, and she was a member of the Jiu Mafia family. She was part of their cleanup crew disposing of bodies and such, which is a life that she evidently treasured and saw with a level of positivity that most of us watching this video probably wouldn't. Nothing is ever directly stated about Misha's personality, but it's all shown to us through this ability. The manifested Nen zombie girl in question is Misha's body with a rather nasty bullet hole between the head, thus showing us how Misha met her end, but Misha appears whenever a GU member kills someone else, and Misha then possesses the body of the deceased and guides it to a disposal location, much like she did in real life. So think about it this way. Misha's loyalty to the GU family was so great that her function was deemed more important than her own life, and she wanted to be part of this family so badly that her dead body remains with them to this very day. In life, Misha probably had a basic manipulation hatsu that allowed her to control corpses and guide them to disposal points, but Zombie Girl is an evolution of this. And that's also an important concept of post-mortem nen. It's usually not just a lingering ability. In most cases, the hatsu itself is even more powerful than it was when it was used in life, which is a phenomena that has not gone unnoticed by living nen masters, and it has even prompted several nen users to actively seek out death as a condition to strengthen their own individual power. And in fact, this deliberate use of death is the most common use of post-mortem nen that we've encountered. Although I will say that the only person in the Hunter x Hunter world to date that has been insane enough to create post-mortem nen with his own life is the ever-compelling Hisoka. After having Crawler use post-mortem nen on him in Heaven's Arena, Hisoka decided why not try it for myself, and so on the verge of death, he gave his bungee gum a command to restart his heart and his lungs, which worked. Hisoka sprang back to life and his gamble paid off. And he's now able to use bungee gum and texture surprise in ways that he couldn't before, by creating prosthetic limbs to replace missing body parts and even using texture surprise to heal superficial damage. With nen, there's a very important concept that vows and restrictions result in a multiplication of output. For example, if I was to create some sort of nen gun that I can only fire with my eyes closed, then it would enhance the power of the fired bullets by the harshness of the restriction of having my eyes closed. But the harshest restriction of all is to die, which Hisoka did. And so he now exists in a state where he has gone beyond what it is possible to achieve in life, and we're not even close to discovering what his new limits are. And fair enough. It's one thing to gamble your own life on a power system that we know frighteningly little about, but I will say there is a much safer yet more sinister way to invoke post-mortem nen, because generally these abilities are powered by the deaths of others rather than the user of the ability, such as the unintentional post-mortem nen use of serial killer blacksmith Benny DeLon. This man was something of an artiste with a cult following, quite literally. There were and still are a cult of people who are following Benny's path to enlightenment, and during his era, Benny killed at least 288 people, all in unique and ever-evolving ways designed to maximize the emotional response of his victims. And afterwards, what he would do is smith himself up a unique knife with its shape and capabilities designed by the victim per se. So the shape of the knives were generally based on the victim's faces. So the more pain they portrayed, the more contorted the knife itself would become. And it's heavily suspected that the method of death inspired the special features of the knives. For example, the Ben knife that Crawler used against Silver Zoldyck specialized in administering poison, indicating that Benny poisoned the victim who inspired this particular knife. And fun fact, this very same morbid knife is referenced in chapter 6 of the gag manga Me and Roboko, where Bondo's mother is holding it ominously, and in chapter 109 she is seen holding a second Ben knife, which is the one that Gon found at auction. Sinister, but that brings us back to post-mortem nen. This knife took Gon's eye because he could sense the residual aura remaining within it. And there are two possible explanations for this. The first is that Benny imbued each of the objects with his own aura subconsciously. He wasn't a conscious nen user, he's what we call a nen genius, but he managed to do that when crafting them, which is simple and straightforward. But that's a lot like basic conjuration. Conjured objects are gonna remain after their user dies, but that doesn't mean that it's a use of post-mortem nen. So the more sinister explanation is that these objects were imbued with the aura of the victims that inspired them, which I think makes a lot more sense from an artistic point of view, given how heavily the victims themselves shaped the end products of the knives. Benny was a great blacksmith, but he wasn't some crafting genius. He was being guided by the tormented remnants of his victims. The lingering life force of the victims themselves were shaping these knives. And hence why these knives are so high quality and sought after, because of this potential invocation of post-mortem nen. And using the lives of others can always be an extremely efficient way to power your own abilities, as is purposely implemented by second Prince Camilla of the Kakin Empire. And her hatsu is quite genius because it involves death on two fronts. It's called Cat's Name, and if Camilla is killed, then this hatsu activates like an end trap card that summons a big old kitty cat to drain the life of the one who killed Camilla and funnel it back into her as delicious goop, thus reviving her. So this is a great showcase of post-mortem power, because a nen ability that flat out kills someone is almost impossible to manifest. The effect is just too strong, and the only possible price to pay for it would be your own life, a life for a life. So Camilla found a very clever way around that. However, she doesn't use the ability in particularly clever ways. She's very out in the open about it and quite brazen, giving the impression expression that she actively wants to die, which she does because it activates the ability, or I should say specifically she wants to be murdered. If Camilla dies naturally or accidentally, then Cat's name will not be there to save her, but as powerful as it is, the easy counter is to just not kill Camilla. It's almost frustratingly simple. You just need to restrain her, throw her in a cell, and let her live to death. That is how you hard counter one of the most powerful abilities in Hunter x Hunter. But not all death is non-consensual, as demonstrated by the post-mortem qualities of First Prince Benjamin's Benjamin Baton ability. So this ability is a specialized and focused application of what happened between Chrollo and the Meteor City Elder. In that case, the Hatsu remained in Skill Hunter due to the will of the Elder to protect Meteor City, and in Benjamin's case, he inherits the abilities of his soldiers after they die in his service. And the idea here is that their loyalty to Benjamin is greater than their concern for their own lives, which Benjamin has very cleverly channeled into this mechanic. On its own, Benjamin Baton does nothing, like how on its own Chrollo's Skill Hunter is just an empty book. But should enough loyal soldiers die, then Benjamin could end up being a threat equitable to Chrollo just due to all of the abilities he has access to, and more importantly, the comparative ease of access. Chrollo has to screw around a lot with his stolen abilities. You gotta take them, put them in a book, open the book, close the book, bookmark book. So much book. But because Benjamin's soldiers are so willing to give themselves to him, we currently know of no restrictions in regards to how Benjamin can use their abilities. And that's purely because of how brilliantly engineered this Hatsu was with Post-mortem Nen in mind. Which is the second part of a now rather disturbing trend where we need to ask the question of, how does the Kakin Empire know so much about Post-mortem Nen? Well, that's likely because the prosperity of their entire empire is sustained on that very concept. Every generation, the Kakin royal family engage in a process known as the Succession Contest, which was implemented by the very first king of Kakin to unite the ancient warring territories. And this is essentially a big Nen death game, with everyone who fails to survive, which is most of them, going on to power future contests. Their life force is taken from one and stored so it can be used in the future. Every life given to the contest is used to conjure a guardian spirit beast to be used by future princes, but also a curiosity is that one of the artifacts used to implement the contest is known as the Lotus Anchorite, which was once a human being who is heavily implied to have engaged in the process of self-mummification. It's even been speculated that this could be the body of the first Kakin king, giving his life so that his nation could continue, which as we know is very classic post-mortem Nen criteria. And other abilities do exist that may or may not dip into this realm. One currently unconfirmed but likely use of post-mortem Nen is Beyond's cursed children, who are all imbued with a special Nen function that is hypothesized to trigger upon death, thus making death a part of the activation requirement. But also stuff like the Chimera Ant process of phagogenesis is arguably an invocation of post-mortem Nen, because it requires death in order to achieve rebirth in a much physically stronger and more versatile ant-some body. And look, I'm just gonna put this out there, the idea of Christianity and Jesus Christ also exists in the world of Hunter x Hunter, and should it be a factual event in this world, then you better believe that Jesus was a Nen user, and that his death and resurrection was an invocation of post-mortem Nen. The Heil-Ly family are a collective of Nen users led by a singular parental entity who consume humans in order to gain power and spread their species across the world until a state of planetary domination has been achieved. It's a very cool idea, I like it a lot, although I can't help but think that we've seen it somewhere before, because that does happen to be the exact same kind of threat that the Chimera Ants pose to humanity. However, this isn't just a case of a lazy writing by Togashi. He isn't just reusing a structure that's worked well in the past, and in fact the Heil-Ly family are an infinitely more horrifying exploration and final evolution of this concept. One that takes all of the strengths of the Chimera Ants with none of the flaws and puts this power in the hands of the worst person imaginable. The more we see of the Heil-Ly family, the more I genuinely want the Chimera Ants back, because I think that humanity had a much brighter path under their plans than it does with the end game of the Heil-Ly. Functionally, the two groups are very similar. The Chimera Ants had a system of phagogenesis, allowing them to consume and convert humans. However, they also sought out Nen users and referred to them as rares, the consumption of which allowed Meruem to grow faster. Meanwhile, the Heil-Ly family takes this concept and gives it a more strictly defined mechanic under the contagion system, where the goal is to reach level 100, and killing regular humans is worth 1 level, whilst killing Nen users is worth 10 levels. So the concept of rares is carried over into the Heil-Ly structure. Nen users to them are kind of like loot goblins, Falklands. But the more horrifying difference here is that with the Chimera ants, only Meruem was able to continue to grow by consuming human lives. Whereas with the Heil-Ly family, every member is capable of growing to the point of becoming a Meruem. Mechanics which are very evocative of the origins of both groups, as each begin with the love of a singular mother figure, the Chimera Ant Queen and Morena Prudeau, both of whom made it their primary goal to gather and propagate a family unit. Morena gave everyone in her family a rebirth via contagion, and the Ant Queen quite literally rebirthed all of the creatures assimilated that she ate and plopped out as Chimera ants. But this is where our first key difference comes into play. The Ant Queen's focus was on a singular entity, the Ant King Meruem. Everyone else was created to serve and protect Meruem. So the Ant Queen was definitely a mother with a favorite child, whereas Morena is a mother who loves all of her children equally. They don't exist to serve any individual purpose. Instead, they are all linked by a common thread. However, Morena is also actively encouraging the individual dreams and goals of their children, however horrific they may be, and mate, they're pretty bad. And this is where, however similarly the ants and the Heil-Ly family were functionally, it becomes clear that they exist to explore completely opposing ideas. One of the more interesting things about the Heil-Ly family is that yes, they do serve as a continuation of the idea of collectivism versus individualism that Togashi introduced with the ants. The Chimera ants by nature needed to work together as a colony, and the key factor that opened up a road to their defeat was the individualism injected by assimilating parts of humanity. Whenever one of the ants went off and did their own thing, it usually resulted in either flat out death or compromising the colony as a whole. And then there were even some ants that tried to strike a balance of both, like Zazan being individual enough to break from Meruem's colony, but collectivist enough to start her own colony in Meteor City. However, what she created was the worst of both worlds, now betting her survival on a tiny portion of the original colony, somehow being able to deliver the same strength and protection as the original. And at face value, the Heil-Ly family are the same, a group of misfits who cannot survive on their own and can only function as a collective. At least that's the impression that I had of them for quite some time, but I was very wrong. The Heil-Ly family is a collective that encourages individualism. Their family isn't designed to stay together. In fact, the key mechanics of contagion are designed to grow the individual members and eventually fracture the family, which makes them, in my opinion, significantly more dangerous than the ants. They are like what the ants would have become if they'd accepted their differences and decided to throw their full support behind every individual ambition rather than submit only to the will of the king. And so it's going to be infinitely harder to crack the Heil-Ly cookie because they don't have a single nexus point that you can even aim for. Sure, it's natural to think go for the leader, go for the head, but if you kill Morena, then it doesn't even matter because each and every family member is designed to become another Morena. But something else I also want to linger on is the status of the family members. For example, before joining, Billy was an arcade employee, Damon was a construction worker, Montever was a college student, Oraga was a waste disposal contractor, Quarel was a repairman, and almost a third of the family had low-level positions in gangs and mafia organizations. The common thread here is that these are the working-class soldier ants of humanity. In the case of newest member Borkson, she's quite literally a soldier, but by and large, the family comes from backgrounds of providing small contributions to the functionality of a human colony. Although there are a couple of unique exceptions like Dogman being a professional wrestler and Gelato being a pro gamer, the latter of which provides no contributions to humanity. But by and large, they are humanity's equivalent of your basic soldier and or I guess worker ants. And this is reinforced by the fact that almost every member of this family is given a mundane character design. One of the reasons why a lot of Hunter x Hunter readers have overlooked the Heil-Ly as a threat is because a lot of their character designs are quite deliberately muted. They don't scream protagonist, antagonist, or even side character. In fact, they don't even scream pay attention to me. A lot of them have the designs of background filler characters because that's the role that they played in society, filling the gaps of the colony. And that is a stark contrast to the Chimera ants, who even at their lowest levels in the hierarchy, all had completely unique and unforgettable designs. There were no mundane ants. They were all completely, at least aesthetically, individual, which definitely should have been a clue for the direction that they were going. Because despite that individuality, the Chimera ants were a top-down threat. It was the orders of the king, the royal guard, the queen, and the squadron leaders that assembled the ants to provide a collective threat. Meanwhile, the Heil-Ly family is a bottom-up threat. The hierarchy of humanity is decaying from the bottom, which is going to bring down and sink the rest of the hierarchy until there's nothing left. With the ants, it's conceptually simple to beat them. You kill the king and the colony ceases to function because because it was a top-down society. But with the Heil-Ly family, it is nowhere near as simple. Currently, Morena serves in, I suppose, the king position. However, again, if Morena was to die, then the Heil-Ly family don't become any less of a threat because each member has the potential and is actively designed to become the next Morena, and ideally, each of them are going to fracture at around the same time, and we will have 20 Morenas instead of one to deal with. I mean, just imagine if every Chimera ant had the potential to become Meruem. And not only that, but they were encouraged to do so. That's what we're dealing with here. But both factions exist for a similar purpose in Hunter x Hunter, which is to directly concept the challenge of humanity, with both of them being geared against the more objectively negative aspects, such as one of the ants' first experiences of humanity being the dictatorship of East Gorto under Mingjol-Ik's body double, featuring other fun faces like Secretary BZF, who had a hobby of buying women and keeping them in a dystopic underground society designed purely to serve him. Other than food, this was Meruem's first experience of humanity, and he found it to be utterly ridiculous. He saw no value in what they were doing, which is an idea that Togashi has amped up with the Heil-Ly family. They currently serve as a direct challenge to the Kakin royal family, with each of the 14 princes designed to be a cross-section of humanity as a whole. Every broad ideology, societal system, and human pursuit can be found within these princes. For example, First Prince Benjamin's blind nationalism and authoritarianism versus Ninth Prince Hulkenberg representing a more ideal democratic system. But neither of these are simple examinations. At the beginning of the succession contest, Hulkenberg is portrayed as the light, the hope for the future, the clear path forward. But we are slowly seeing him and his ideology being corrupted, whilst Benjamin, the guy who initially appeared as the obvious villain, is on the opposite path. He's becoming more and more humanized, and so someone who appeared to be a vicious tyrant in the beginning of the arc is now much more nuanced, principled, and shockingly empathetic to those around him. That is one small, tiny example of the dynamics going on within the princes. There are so many more, but that's not the point of this video. The point of this video is to make it very clear that the Heil-Ly family, in their immediate quest to destroy the Kakin Empire, have positioned themselves as an enemy of humanity as a whole, because that is what the Kakin royal family represents, just as the Chimera ants presented themselves as an enemy of humanity as well. However, many of the ants did eventually come to appreciate that wide spectrum of what humanity has to offer, like UP developing respect for Knuckle, or Meruem rewarding his experiences with Komugi and Netero, with the plan of reassessing how many and what type of humans were to be used as food, whilst allowing a section of them to live in a permanent human preservation. I know that saying it like that doesn't make it sound hugely generous, but it is a colossal step forward from where the ants began. And it's also a step that the Heil-Ly family will never take. Because unlike the ants, they already understand humanity. They were born into it, and they have soundly rejected it. And more importantly, they possess a power that the ants never could have dreamed of, which was described by Isaac Netero as the bottomless malice within the human heart. Meruem was physically limitless, but not even he could overcome the depths that humanity was willing to sink to. However, this time it's a more even matchup. Human versus human, limitless versus limitless, bottomless malice versus bottomless malice. He didn't know this at the time, but Morena Prudo is the perfect example of what Netero was referring to, because Morena is almost malice personified. She was born from the darkest possible pit of human potential through the Kakin Carnival, and from childhood she was designated not as a child, not even as a human, but as meat, and she was subject to every terrible thing a human could undergo that I can't say on YouTube, but whatever it is you're thinking, it happened to Morena. She was born in such a dark place that we don't even know her real name. Morena Prudo is an identity that she stole from someone else as one of her many steps towards acquiring power. And so Morena herself is almost an entity that transcends the basic aspects of humanity, such as identity. She was born at the very bottom of society, the person with objectively the least amount of power who we come dangerously close to not even recognizing as human, but who through sheer malice alone has now risen to become one of the greatest threats to the entire human race, as have the rest of her family. Each of the Heil-Ly members were born somewhere at the bottom of human society and are rising together through their mutual hatred. It's the fact that one of the greatest threats in Hunter x Hunter isn't a singular Morena, nor is it a corrupt hunter or the Phantom Troop, not even the Ant King or a Dark Continent Calamity. The greatest threat in this series right now is an assortment of minimum wage workers who spawned into a terrible zone with abysmal stats to the point where almost no one even registers the fact that they even exist. And it's the combination of all of those negative circumstances that have come together to forge this limitless potential. And in regards to contagion, the ability is limited only by the potential of humanity itself. It can replicate itself as much as required until humanity ceases to exist. Every time that humans find a way to evolve and propagate, contagion will follow. This is what the Chimera ants were missing, although it is something that they may have eventually developed over time. Remember that Meruem was only 40 days old, and at their oldest, the rest of the ants were only about 90 days old. They were an infant, innocent species, completely unprepared to deal with and tap into their assimilated humanity. And sure, the Heil-Ly members wouldn't have been capable of tapping into this malice in their infancy either. However, they have now had decades upon decades of experience, relentlessly suffering and charging that power of malice. This is a power that the ants never could have dreamed of, nor would they probably have wanted to. But both factions also have some oddly specific parallels. One great example being Ramot and Luini, two very brash characters easily intoxicated by a drop of Nen, both being responsible for growing the strength of their groups, Ramot through punching people, and Luini through facilitated murder via his Nen ability, with both meeting the exact same fate of being decapitated, Ramot by Killua and Luini by Nobunaga. So the Heil-Ly family are playing a different song using the same beat. And so it does make me wonder about the future, because I have heard this song before, and there are certain key beats that we haven't reached yet. For example, one that comes to mind would be a kite moment. But I think this is only a matter of time away. I imagine something like this is going to come when one of the Heil-Ly members reaches level 100 and shows us the full potential of what the family are working towards, much like the birth of Neferpito as the first royal guard. And another key beat would be a Komugi, who we actually may have already met. In the same way that Meruem played a mundane game with Komugi, we also had Morena play a mundane game with Borkson, the newest Heil-Ly recruit, and Borkson could end up being a reverse Komugi. Komugi was able to break through to Meruem and change him, even though that wasn't her intention. But in our flipped examination, perhaps Morena will be able to break through to Borkson and change her, or that Borkson will try and Komugi her way into Morena, but she'll fail, because Komugi was a philosophical challenge to the system, something that made Meruem very cognizant of different types of strength and value that exists within humans. However, I can't see Morena or the Heil-Ly family ever being convinced of that brand of optimism. However, what I can see is Borkson gradually coming to embrace their perspective. She's already well aware of the corruption within the Kakin Empire, and even serves within Saraidnik's branch of the royal military. If there was anyone in a position to be seduced by Morena's ideology, it's Borkson. But as for how this ends, if we're looking at an inverted Chimera ant arc, then following that to its natural conclusion would mean the success of the Heil-Ly family. And in a series like Hunter x Hunter, I definitely would not rule that out. For Togashi to end his story as well as his thesis of humanity with the bottomless malice of the human heart on full display. The original ending of Hunter x Hunter has just been uncovered, and in this rejected finale, we were supposed to see Crawler vs. Kurapika, Jing Freaks vs. Silver Zoldyck, and most shockingly of all, Gon vs. Killua. And in each of these matchups, at least one character dies. Alright, so this ending has been a bit of a myth in the Hunter x Hunter fandom for as long as I can remember, decades potentially, but its existence was finally confirmed as a result of a storyboard auction, a lot of which was then posted online by the buyer. And we now know exactly how the original Hunter x Hunter 1999 anime was supposed to end, a series that on its own was a wild ride that covered up to the end of York New City in 62 episodes and then went on to cover Greed Island in a further 20 episodes released through OVAs. But look, if you're significantly younger than me, then let me explain how anime used to work in the late 90s and early 2000s. Back in the day, right, weekly manga would be picked up extraordinarily quickly once it achieved a modicum of popularity in a magazine. And Hunter x Hunter is a fantastic example of this, very convenient because that's what the video is about. In this video, we're talking about the 1999 anime, and the Hunter x Hunter manga was first published on March 16th, 1998. So the manga was in publication for less than a year before a decision was made to adapt it into an anime that would start airing late the following next year in 1999. Now, to be fair, in this case, Yoshihiro Togashi would have played a huge part in this, I would say, very preemptive decision, primarily because he'd already found established success with Yu Yu Hakusho, which finished airing in 1994. If Hunter x Hunter hadn't come from someone who had already helmed a successful series in both manga and anime form, then I do think they would have waited a bit longer, but not much longer. Take One Piece for example. The manga started in 1997 and it had an anime airing by 1999, and that came from Eiichiro Oda, who at the time was an absolute no-name with no previous track record. And even then, One Piece was rushed into an anime adaptation. Now, the big issue with doing this is how quickly the anime anime series catches up to the manga material, especially in the case of Hunter x Hunter, because every anime episode is ideally paced at about 3 manga chapters, which is why the 1999 anime has such an extreme amount of filler in it, some of it quite interesting, some of it quite funny, some of it just weird, but the 1999 series was riddled with it because without this filler, it would have blasted past the manga in no time, which back in the day, a lot of series often did. And the solution to this problem wasn't to slow down, it wasn't to take breaks, it wasn't to change publication into, say, a seasonal format. No, the solution was, more often than not, to completely abandon the source material and have the anime go off on its own completely different path and create its own exclusive ending. A great example of this is the original 2003 Full Metal Alchemist anime, which rapidly caught up to its manga source material and deviated off onto its own into an alternate canon and concluded the series in what is, in my opinion, a very haphazard and unsatisfying way. This is the exact same path that the 1999 Hunter x Hunter anime could and very almost did take, and we actually have the storyboards of what was proposed to be the final episode of Hunter x Hunter. This is the original episode 64, which was never made, and it had the extremely difficult task of wrapping up all of Hunter x Hunter in a single episode, which was not written by Togashi, but by the anime staff. And I was blown away when I saw what they tried to do, and not in a good way. I cannot believe that this ever got anywhere near happening, but before we get to that episode, more changes were going to need to be made to previous episodes to facilitate it. Director of the 1999 anime, Kazuhiro Furuhashi, had a lust for drama not seen since the days of William Shakespeare, and he wanted to change the ending of York New City to have one final showdown between Chrollo and Kurapika, during which Chrollo would be killed and Kurapika would lose an eye, but also lose a lot more. This storyboard depicts Kurapika on the verge of death, and the reason for said death isn't entirely clear, but it states that Kurapika's heart is about to stop, which implies that he's done something that goes against the Nen restrictions that he set himself in order to kill Chrollo. And in his final moments, Kurapika appears to say absolutely nothing to either Gon or Killua, and then Kurapika goes on to die in Leorio's arms, which is quite the bold maneuver, killing both Kurapika and Chrollo. Wild idea, considering that they've now become essentially our main protagonists in the current manga arc. And look, I haven't found anything personally that supports this yet, but allegedly each and every member of the Phantom Troop was also supposed to die by this point, just making sure to leave absolutely nothing open for a future series. Again, I can't confirm that. A lot of people, I think, are just coming to their own conclusion, so that might not be the case. But also, given what's about to happen next, maybe. As you can imagine, Kurapika's death then took a toll on our surviving cast members, and there's a very bitter moment where Gon, Killua, and Leorio split up, with Gon returning to Whale Island, and waiting for him there is not just Mito, but also Kite and Jing, although I don't believe we see the reunion itself. With the storyboard pieces we have, it seems more like Gon comes home, he sees Kite and Jing, and then we cut to what I can only describe as utter madness, because what happens next is a 7-year time skip, which brings us to the original ending of the never produced episode 64, which means that Gon and Killua are both somewhere between 18 and 19, and Killua has had a particularly dark 7 years because he apparently went back to the Zoldyck family estate and has now transformed into the cold Zoldyck assassin archetype presented by Silver, Illumi, and Zeno. And though conceptually I don't mind this change, just because the anime was using a plot point left open, and to this day still remains left open, which was Silver claiming that one day Killua would come back, and he had the utmost of confidence that Killua would embrace his destiny as the eventual head of the Zoldyck family. I might not agree with how we got to this point by sacrificing Kurapika and everything, but I'm gonna be fair, it does make a bit of sense with what we knew at the time. And Killua is now such a trusted assassin that he's out on a mission with his father Silver, and their target just so happens to be, gasp, Jing Freaks, who they find in what appears to be some sort of crater forest. What's Jing doing alone in a hole? Dunno, that's his business. But Silver commences to fight battle Jing while Killua, I don't know, I guess watches. He's not involved in this fight at all yet, and this isn't quite the epic battle of the best Nen users in the world that you would expect, because it appears that the outcome occurs off screen and we just see the aftermath of it. And we see it through the first of a series of unrelenting dramatic twists as Gon arrives onto the battlefield just as the fight ends, with Silver Zoldyck being reflected in his right eye and his father Jing being reflected in the left, which is really not good news for Gon because Jing is the one on his knees in a standard pose of defeat. However, twist number the second, for reasons that we can only speculate, Silver Zoldyck then appears to rip out his own heart, heart. One way this could have happened is if the anime made Jing a manipulator and he had Silver do this to himself, or if Jing somehow attacked the heart and Silver removed it to die pure or some kind of crap. I don't know about that. What I do know is that this was probably Jing's doing, because Killua, mate, he gets very upset. And at this point, Jing is exhausted on the floor from his fight battle, so Killua uses this opportunity to launch at him and take revenge for Silver's death. However, Gon steps in to protect Jing, and we have a Nen clash, with Gon erecting a defensive something or other, with Killua attempting to drill through it with his claws or something or other. This is an extremely dramatic moment, and I'm going to put this out there right now. One of these boys is about to die. Which one will it be? We'll find out in a bit, because first, drama is always incomplete without emotional observers, as we also see Mito arrive onto the battlefield, who I guess tries to rush to Gon's aid. However, Mito is held back by Kite, who's also here for reasons and not doing anything to help either Jing or Gon, for more reasons that mere images are incapable of explaining. So we have none of the help situation. Kite's just going to watch and let the situation play out and just hope for the best. Anyway, Killua rips out Gon's heart in an extremely brutally depicted sequence, and this is very clever, right? Because here's what happened. What we've already learned as audience members from Silver ripping his own heart out is that people die without their hearts. So I guess that could be considered foreshadowing for this moment where Gon loses his heart, because now we know that Gon's gonna die. That's right, Gon dies, and the final shot of Hunter x Hunter 1999 was Mito watching Gon get his heart ripped out and depart this world. The end. Hold for applause. So obviously the reason why this ending never happened is because of how incredibly awful it was in each and every way. But the ideas behind it are very much in keeping with this specific era of anime during which Hunter x Hunter aired. The 90s was a very somber time for anime. It was very much an era crowned by successful titles like Cowboy Bebop and Neon Genesis Evangelion, among many others that had a pattern of ending on a bittersweet note, if not outright bitter, brutal, and cold. And then as the 2000s went on, anime started to go in a much more optimistic direction. But I can definitely see why the 1999 director was tempted to take Hunter x Hunter down this path, because it was just sort of the established thing that you would do. And this ending is also lacking some of the context set up by the 1999 anime itself. For example, to us, Killua, my darling boy, him growing up to kill Gon is absolutely unthinkable, especially after everything he did during the election arc, which wasn't even close to existing when the anime aired. But the 1999 anime did have a much darker tone overall, and Killua is a prime source of that. The 1999 series portrays him as a lot more edgy and takes away a lot of his childlike joy. So within this series, Killua's future does make slightly more sense, as does Kurapika's death. After he kills Uvagin in the 1999 anime, it's played as if Kurapika has committed a deep sin that he will never be able to recover from, and Kurapika himself is left mentally scarred after the killing, which is not at all like the cold matter-of-fact man he was in the manga and the 2011 anime. So Kurapika's death could be seen as a fair punishment for crossing a moral line that he shouldn't have, or at least that would be the traditional wisdom of shows that have their characters explore the darkness. But it is completely counter to Hunter x Hunter, which is not a world at all bound by morality. There are very few characters who have never crossed a moral line, and almost none who have been punished for doing something that we humans would consider bad. In fact, I'm certain there's more examples of people being rewarded for crossing those lines than we have examples of them being punished. And in terms of Gon's death, the way I see it is that this was an attempt for the anime to artfully conclude his purity, which is also very much amped up in the 1999 series. And to be fair, in the very beginning of Hunter x Hunter, he was that more standard shonen protagonist of purity. So I guess the director of the 1999 series was aiming to have Gon sacrifice himself to save his father with an almost religious level of martyrdom. But I do have questions about why they landed on Gon doing the sacrifice instead of maybe Jing sacrificing himself to save Gon. But I guess the problem there would be that would leave a story to tell. Like, what does Gon do now that his father is dead? Does he go after Killua? Does he have to learn to accept it? What does he do? Don't know. All I know is that we don't have enough time in a single episode to explore that, so killing Gon just seems like the easiest full stop. But the thing I find most satisfactory about this ending is Gon's reunion with Jing. He just goes home and his father's there. I get that finding Jing was the entire premise of the series, and to conclude it, you would need to address it, but this just feels so lazy and unearned. And that might be because of everything that I and we knew that Gon had to go through to find Jing. But this 1999 business, it's very Shakespeare, and I do not mean the good Shakespeare. I mean the Shakespeare that begins with a god descending from the heavens, bringing everyone together and solving all of their problems in a single paragraph, because sometimes even Shakespeare couldn't figure out how to solve all of the problems he created. That's what this is. Tragedy occurs, Gon decides to go home, and everyone's there waiting for him. Mito, Jing, and even Kite. But there is also one extremely important element missing from his ending, and that is anything to do with Hisoka. Now, I have to believe that he was included somewhere in this ending, and we just don't have the storyboards for it because it feels very odd to not have him addressed at all, considering how desperately all of these major characters were being brought together to wrap up everything that was Hunter x Hunter. And this is the only thing that gives a bit of credibility to the idea that the rest of the Phantom Troop died as well in the previous episodes, because Hisoka may very well have been part of that. He may have been cleaned up long before we got to 64. And something else that we should consider here is the idea of money. Because look, killing off the vast majority of your cast traditionally makes it very difficult to produce more anime, which they did with the Greed Island OVAs, so there was probably a business element to not doing this ending as well, so as not to completely cut off any opportunities to adapt further Hunter x Hunter arcs. And to continue being fair to the tone of the ending, I don't know how conceptually different this is going to be to Togashi's desired ending for the manga. Togashi stated that the ending he most wants to do would leave the audience feeling very unsatisfied, but I do have faith that no matter what he wants to do, it would be far better executed than this proposed ending. So thankfully this ending never came into existence, but I am endlessly fascinated by how close it was to happening. This is my hypothesis. Isaac Netero traveled to the Dark Continent. There he met Don Freaks on the shoreline of Lake Mobius. Netero then returned to the human realm with the first half of Don's book, Journey to the New World. Netero then gave a copy of that book to Jing Freaks, which started his obsession with the Dark Continent, while Zig Zoldyck stayed behind to travel with Don. That's my thinking. Now let's see if it works. Hello and welcome to the New World Review, your source for everything anime and manga, and today we're here to discuss quite possibly the only successful return journey to the Dark Continent that we know of, being the Netero expedition. And we're doing this because I was posed an intriguing question by a user named Raging Miku, who inquired as to whether or not Zig Zoldyck, a member of this expedition, was still alive. Because there is some very interesting information to suggest that he may have actually died. However, as I looked further into it, a much bigger picture started to unravel, threatening to provide potential answers to many of our lingering questions. So I think it's about time that we examined the mysteries behind the Netero voyage. And it's all going to begin with a quick round of Netero or Neta No, a very simple minigame, the rules of which are as follows. I am going to ask you a multiple choice trivia question about our former chairman, and should you answer incorrectly, then your punishment will be to subscribe to the New World Review, which will result in consistent injections of Hunter-based content administered directly into your YouTube feed. Meanwhile, if you are correct, then you will be awarded with a slap on the butt from the 100 type Guanyin Bodhisattva. So here is our trivia question. How old was Netero when he began training in the mountains? A, 45, B, 46, or C, 47? All fairly reasonable sounding midlife states of being, so please do make your choice now and we shall reveal the answer in 3, 2, 1, and bam, it was B, 46 years old. So if you guessed incorrectly, then you know the thing to do, and please do say hi in the comments below if you are new to our association. Welcome. But let's begin with the official story. Here's a guy, his name is Steiner, and he is important because he is a powerful bureaucrat within the IPA, an organization which is designed to regulate travel to and from the Dark Continent. In a very short amount of time, Steiner has become one of the world's foremost authorities on the Dark Continent, due primarily to having read a very fun book called Journey to the New World East Edition, which was of course penned by the almost mythical figure of Don Freaks. In addition to this, Steiner has information on all officially recorded human journeys to the Dark Continent, which according to him come to a grand total of 149 ventures. Of those 149, only 5 expeditions had people return from the continent, which assumes that the other 144 had a 100% casualty rate. Now, of the 5 voyages which did see individuals return, there were only 28 survivors in total, and of those 28, only 3 of them were able to reintegrate into society. And according to official statistics, that would be a survival rate of 0.04%. Fairly terrifying. But I bring this up because the number 3 gets speculated on here and there for being a bit awkward, primarily because 3 is not 4. And 4 is the number of characters we know of who have visited the continent and potentially returned. So we have Isaac Netero, Linnea Derv, Zig Zoldyck, Nordic, and of course beyond Netero. And given that we know for a fact that Netero, Linné, and beyond all returned, it can be easy at face value to assign Zig with a rather unfortunate fate because he is the fourth known character of a maximum of 3 confirmed survivors. But what does get missed quite a bit is that Steiner also states that of those 3, Beyond is the only one alive today, which more or less confirms that Steiner is unaware of Netero's unofficial journey. Because sure, Netero is now dead, however Linné is still alive and well, so it should be at least 2 survivors if they were factored in. So luckily for Zig, this gives him a lot of potential to, not be dead. To complicate matters though, this is another thing that often gets overlooked, but Netero actually set foot on the Dark Continent twice, according to him. One of these occasions is the unofficial voyage that we are exploring in this video, but the other is completely unknown. It's almost certainly another sneaky unofficial trip, because the voyages with survivors that we know of were all conducted by the V5 nations, who did so without informing the Hunter Association. Very sneaky of them, but meaning that Netero likely would have had no involvement with them. But the most interesting thing Steiner says is that mankind has never succeeded at making a round trip, but then he has this brief inner thought where he thinks to himself, not officially, implying that he may have knowledge of some unofficial journeys, or just showing us that Steiner has a healthy dose of skepticism about him, realizing all of the potential faults in officially collated knowledge. And one question that Steiner may have failed to ask at this point is, where did their Dark Continent knowledge come from? Who published Journey to the New World? Because it was written by Don Freaks, yes, but it was clearly not published or distributed by him. So that leaves us with a mystery publisher, which leads us quite nicely now into Jing Freaks. Jing is a unique man for about 1 billion different reasons. However, on this occasion, he possesses some pretty insane knowledge. In fact, it's only because of Jing that we even know about Netero's voyage to begin with. Jing dropped that massive nugget when he was explaining the dangers of the Dark Continent to Beyond's expedition team. And this is pretty huge because you need to ask, why Jing? And you can't say that sure, he knew because he was a Zodiac in the Hunter Association and they have all kinds of special knowledge of Netero's stuffery, because they don't, or they do, but not so much on this. Jing is the only one who knew, because weirdly enough, some of the Zodiacs didn't even know that the Dark Continent existed. And even the one who had the most intimate knowledge of it, Pariston, was himself unaware of Netero's journey. So for whatever reason, Jing Freaks was entrusted with this knowledge, something that Netero clearly had no inclination of giving up on a whim. And we know that it was Netero who told Jing directly, because Jing even quotes the former chairman's words, which were, "This place is too big. It's off the charts." And this decision to tell Jing and Jing alone is why I propose that on Netero's unofficial voyage, that he may have encountered Don Freaks. Now, it's hard to put a timeline on exactly when Netero visited the Dark Continent. However, judging by his hair length and general aesthetic presentation, as well as Netero's own words that he visited the continent when he was quite young, this would imply that Netero visited prior to his training in the mountains at the age of 46, which is actually a pretty massive thing to point out, because now we're talking about Netero before he achieved his enlightened god mode Nen abilities. He was still likely quite powerful, but nowhere near the incarnation of him that we're familiar with, and perhaps visiting the continent is what prompted Netero to take some time to reflect in the human world. That doesn't necessarily matter though, because we do know for a fact that Don would have been on the Dark Continent at the same time as Netero's group, because he initially set out to explore the landmass roughly 300 years ago. And now I think the hurdle that may come up in this discussion is, well, how did they encounter each other? It's hard to pin down, but Don may have literally had a couple of centuries of head start on Netero exploring the continent, so there's no way they could have met, yeah? Well, no, in fact, not yeah. In fact, no. The hundreds of years of exploration thing may be true, but we also need to keep Don Freak's mission in mind. He did not set out to explore the depths of the Dark Continent. His goal was to spend his life traveling the shoreline of Lake Mobius and logging his experiences. So look, it's all about chance here, but at any given time over the last 300 years, Don Freaks was theoretically reachable, depending on which part of the human world you set out from and which part of the continent you landed on. So my proposal is that Netero and his party happened to land on a piece of shoreline very close to where Don was currently traveling, which may actually explain quite a bit. For example, how did Netero survive the Dark Continent? Given that he was more of a sprightly young brat at the time, there was a very real risk of death. And stumbling across Don, a man who was very well versed in Dark Continent survival, may very well have saved his life. And not only that, but extended his life. Because fun thing here, prior to his death, Netero was at least 110 years old. I emphasize the whole at least thing because it's implied that he was almost certainly way older. But even the baseline of 110 is insane because humans in Hunter x Hunter follow a more real world life expectancy. Take Xenozoldic for example. He's only 67 and he looks even older than Netero did at least twice his age. Now Don Freaks did find an answer to this whole aging problem, which was the substance of nitro rice, a food item on the Dark Continent that extends one's life, which was logged in his journal, and it actually inspired one of the official voyages to embark and find it, although they did fail. They failed catastrophically. And it seems very unlikely that Netero and his group would have just stumbled upon the substance by sheer luck, but if Don were to have shared some of his already gathered nitro rice, then it would explain why both Netero and Lene have lived the absurdly long lives they have. That or scenarios could get slightly more complicated. For example, Netero meets Don on the first voyage, learns of the rice, and then sets out on a second expedition to acquire it. That's one of a ton of possible different scenarios, but the thing I keep coming back to is how the writing of Don Freaks returned to the human world. It's been said that Journey to the New World East Edition was published, quote, several centuries ago, which is very vague, but then again, so is Netero's age. I mean, given that he was known to fight against Xenozoldic's grandfather Maha, it's impossible to tell just how long this man may have existed, which is why I think it's entirely possible that Netero met Don Freaks on the Dark Continent and was entrusted with delivering the first half of his book to humanity, which would have been in Netero's best interest because he was the one who seriously pushed for travel to the Dark Continent to be forbidden. So this book would have served as a fine warning to most not to risk opening Pandora's box. However, it also goes on to reinforce the Jing connection. However many years back, decades, maybe even centuries later, this bright young go-getter by the name of Jing Freaks took the Hunter exam and was the only one of his year to pass. Jing has a demonstrated interest in archaeology and human history, and recognizing that delicious Freaks lineage, Isaac Netero decided to tell him about at least one of his Dark Continent expeditions, and may have even piqued his interest by pointing him in the direction of Don's book. And then you know what? A whole generation later, Netero would encounter yet another Freaks by the name of Gon, a child which he took an unusual interest in, although when you've already met two exceptional members of the Freaks clan, I'm sure that Gon's potential would have been very easy to see, especially when accompanied by a Zoldyck, a family with whom Netero seems to share an even deeper history, which actually leads us back to Zig. He still has a big question mark over his head with a few potential solutions. One thought we do need to establish is that Zig and Maha Zoldyck may be the same person. I'm not going to go into huge detail about this because I have a whole different video exploring that topic, but it is a fairly solid evidence-backed thought. Another possibility is that just as suggested by the person who inspired this video, Zig Zoldyck may be dead. Given Netero's apparent inexperience when he landed on the Dark Continent with Zig and Lene, a casualty would have not at all been unexpected. Zig could have died, and that may even be a reason for Maha Zoldyck to fight Netero as an endeavor of familial revenge. But the third and most outlandish possibility is that for whatever reason, Zig may have chosen to stay on the Dark Continent and travel with Don Freaks. And I'm not gonna lie, I like this idea primarily because it would involve forging another Freaks Zoldyck duo and really wrapping up Hunter x Hunter in a nice, neat little narrative package. But it is 100% pure speculation. There's just something very appealing to me about Netero leaving the Dark Continent with his last image being of a Freaks and a Zoldyck standing side by side. Then, potentially centuries later, during the 287th Hunter exam, in comes Gon Freaks and Killua Zoldyck, causing a wave of untold nostalgia within Netero, and hence why he took such a strong interest in both of them, even to the point where he allowed them both to participate in the Chimera Ant mission. The question is, would Togashi do such a thing? And honestly, I'm not so sure. Hunter x Hunter doesn't usually end up being that neat and or satisfying. However, Togashi was really laying some very nice foundations with this whole Dark Continent business, and I can only hope that we get to explore the deeper story of these characters in the future.